All right, spring football practice and the spring game in the books for Syracuse football. We bring in John Cassillo from Noon's Magician to help us sort through the orange projected toward August and into the 2016 regular season. John, as always, it's a good discussion. Thanks so much for joining us. And we got to talk about your new head coach because obviously the season was played in 2015. You bring in Dino Babers. You get a feel for what the program could look like into 2016. It's difficult to tell because no games have been played that mean anything. But at the same time, have you seen any transitional markings of his regime versus what you've seen in the past?
Oh, of course. I mean, and this isn't to run the old coaching staff over the coals, but at the same time, they were not an offensively focused group in a lot of ways. I mean, the offense last year was kind of option-based. It was supposed to be fast, but wasn't. George McDonald's old offense a couple of years ago was supposed to be fast, never really got on track. This offense, on the other hand, I mean, if nothing else, it'll run with a hell of a lot of speed. It's not going to be up to the same level that maybe Bowling Green's offense was last year or Baylor's offense that offense is based off of. But you're going to be looking at a much faster paced Syracuse team. And based on what we saw in the spring game, this is going to be a team that is going to be able to throw the ball downfield much better than it has in the last few seasons.
So unless you have superior talent, that's obvious superior talent, that seems to be the way the teams are going, and it seems to be fairly effective until the defenses catch up to it and figure it out, that you get mismatches on the field, you run at a tempo, you get the plays called, you get to the line, and you roll from there without calling the huddle, and you dictate the pace of the game, and it seems to be successful. And if maybe you're a step behind in terms of talent, you can create some mismatches and get the ball in space to those people that you'd like to get it to in space. So the job of that particular player is obviously coming down to the quarterback position. You've got a battle on your hands. Can you kind of set us up for the quarterback position and what we can expect? Maybe not just necessarily what we saw in the spring game, but for the entirety of practice. I know it's difficult to get information out, but how as you see it projecting toward more practice time in August?
Sure. I mean, from what we can tell, Eric Dungey, I mean, he had trouble staying on the field last year, but it seems like he's still going to be the guy. Him and Babers have taken a liking to each other. Babers hasn't committed to him as the starter or anyone as a starter at any position yet. But where Dungey seems to understand things right away is just how fast this game needs to be played in Babers' offense. He was complimentary of his fellow offensive players after the spring game, but he said himself and echoed Babers that things needed to be faster. He really enjoys the offense already. It seems like it mimics a lot of what he did back in high school, up in Oregon. And he's a big fan of the no huddle. He's a real cerebral guy too. Had a couple Ivy League offers on top of Syracuse. So I think he's probably the guy. He's also spent a lot of the offseason kind of adding some weight, and he's already added about 15 pounds. He's going to try to run a little bit less so that he's not getting hit the way he was. But if he does get hit, he's probably going to be able to take it a little bit better than last year's kind of 180 to 185 max frame that he was sporting.
Hey, John, as we look at the defense, obviously that was a situation where just a few years ago under Scott Schaefer in back-to-back bowl appearances, the defense was somewhat solidified. He had a really strong one a few years ago, took a step back. Obviously, it resulted in the standings. Your thoughts along the defensive front, because it starts there.
The defensive line is going to have to replace a lot. We've had a lot of attrition. We've had a lot of guys graduate. I think it's going to be a very young group, and in some ways that's good because I feel like last year's did kind of get shredded. In others, it's going to be a little bit of a struggle against some of the faster, bigger teams that we face. Obviously, your Florida State, your Clemson's, your Louisville's to a point, Notre Dame as well on this year's schedule. Stephen Clark is probably your standout along with Jake Pickard. And he plays out on the end. Clark is inside. Those two are your major standouts, but Kayton Samuels and Chris Slayton, they got plenty of playing time last year. And those two, going into their redshirt sophomore years, given that experience that they've had, could really, help anchor, again, a defensive line that might be a little rough around the edges at the beginning, but if they can round into form, could end up being a surprising unit in the ACC.
So obviously the success of the defensive line is a perfect segue into the secondary and how the secondary is perceived. You need a pass rush. You need a push up front to give those guys any kind of a chance in the backfield. But even when you've had that, the defensive backfield play hasn't been the best. Again, just in the last year or two, especially. Your thoughts about the secondary and how it shakes out coming into 2016?
I think the secondary is just poised to be better. I mean, I'm not going to call it addition by subtraction, but I just think the scheme might be a little bit more focused on sound coverage. We're going to be running a Tampa 2 with Babers and his defense coordinator, Brian Ward. So that's predicated on sound coverage, and that goes in the linebackers on back. I think last year and previous years under Schaefer, it was a lot more about big plays and big hits. So it's going to be a little bit of a transition for these guys. Whether you're looking at, a Rodney Williams or an Antoine Cordy, some guys that are probably going to start around safety. Juwan Dowell's another name to look out for, with Cordell Hudson as well. These are all fairly young guys. But for them, it's just going to be whether they can transition quickly, from a group that was very much based on big hits, big plays, interceptions, to a group that, yes, interceptions are great, but you're going to be looking at sound coverage first and foremost and making sure guys aren't as wide open as we've seen them for Syracuse the last couple seasons.
So, John, of course, the goal of any program between the end of spring practice and the first week of fall practice is keep guys out of trouble and keep them healthy. So those are the two goals that are pretty much consistent across the board. Your thoughts about going into August? What would be a successful August? What did you see in the last month based on what you heard? I know, again, difficult to get information, but based on what you heard and what you saw in the spring game, that gives you a little bit of hope of maybe some guys that stood out for you.
I think the big key here is just that there's such a buy-in in the new system. I mean, a lot of people thought afterwards you had a roster that was very, very dedicated to Schaefer and his staff, and there was worries about attrition, about buy-in, about conditioning, considering they were playing at a much slower pace before. But to be honest, I think everyone's said the right things on both sides. The players seem really excited. I think Dungey's due for a breakout year now, based on how quickly he seemed to understand the offense. I think where Syracuse is kind of lacked in most recent years is having those offensive players that you just go, wow, at least for a full season. I think this year we might actually have a few of them. You're looking at, really quick guys like Irv Phillips. Jordan Fredericks is looking to lose some weight in the backfield. Where people could really be surprised, though, is Dante Strickland, who's kind of been playing a hybrid running back wide receiver role, as well as Moe Neal, who's a true freshman. He showed up on campus in January, and the speed that he showed in that spring game was really, really impressive. At one point, I was kind of wondering what type of role he'd be able to play in his first year, but based on that speed that he was able to display, I think you're going to end up seeing him at least probably 3 to 5 times a game, just as not even a change of pace, but just a guy who can run with a hell of a lot of burst between the tackles.
Well, Percy Harvin, possibly.
Perhaps.
A guy that, can't see it 20 or 25 times, but get him on the edge, get him to do something, break a game open, possibly. All right, John, we try to keep track of everyone, so we appreciate your input on the Orange here as we get toward August.
Of course, much appreciated, Mark.